Poor nurse rescues a poisoned stranger, shocked to discover he's a millionaire who loves her. The hospital was buzzing with activity, a frenetic energy that only intensified as the clock ticked closer to midnight. The heart of Sweden seemed far away here in the sterile, fluorescent-lit corridors of the community hospital. Nurses rushed past with clipped steps, and the low hum of machines echoed through the hallways. This was Emma Brooks's world, a place where lives were saved and lost in the span of minutes, where the pressure was relentless, but also where she found purpose in the midst of chaos. Emma Brooks, at 27, was still adjusting to the weight of her responsibilities. A nurse in the emergency department, she spent her days triaging patients, assisting doctors, and ensuring the hospital ran as smoothly as possible despite the overwhelming demand. She had been here for 5 years now, having chosen this path out of a deep desire to help people. Her kind-hearted nature made her a favorite among the patients, who often looked to her not just for medical care, but for the comfort of her presence, the warmth she exuded even in the harshest of circumstances. Yet, for all her hard work and dedication, Emma Brooks felt invisible in a world that often celebrated power, wealth, and status, things she knew little of. She came from humble beginnings and had spent most of her adult life trying to balance the responsibilities of caring for her sick mother with paying off mounting student loans. Her life was far from extraordinary. There was no glitter, no fanfare, just endless days spent between the hospital's walls, caring for strangers, but rarely tending to herself. Tonight, though, would be different. The hospital was hosting a high-profile charity event, and with it came a swarm of well-dressed individuals, their lives far removed from the one Emma Brooks knew. She had little interest in the extravagance of the event, but her shift had been extended, and her duties called her to the emergency room where she could do what she loved best: help people. Her thoughts briefly drifted to her mother, who was recovering at home under the care of a nurse, before she steeled herself and focused on the patients who needed her. Meanwhile, in the VIP section of the gala just outside the hospital, Ethan Gray, the powerful and untouchable CEO of a global tech company, was making his usual appearance. Tall, sharp-featured, and impeccably dressed, Ethan Gray was the epitome of power and control. At 34, he had built an empire from the ground up, admired by some and feared by others. Known for his ruthlessness in business, he rarely showed emotion and never allowed anyone to see beyond the cold, calculating exterior he had crafted over the years. He wasn't a man accustomed to being vulnerable. Yet that night, vulnerability found him unexpectedly. While sipping his drink at the event, a sharp pain suddenly seized his chest, followed by nausea and dizziness. His vision blurred, and for a brief moment his surroundings seemed to spin. It was all too sudden, too calculated. His body screamed in protest, and his mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. Before he could react, his body betrayed him entirely. He collapsed, the once controlled and composed man now crumpling to the floor in front of dozens of shocked onlookers. Panic spread through the room as his body continued to twitch, signs of an obvious and severe poisoning. The event's guests, usually composed, now scrambled for help. But as the situation worsened, the real chaos began. Security rushed to contain the scene, but none of the guests, no matter how important or well-connected, knew what to do. As the minutes ticked by, a call went out to the hospital, an emergency of the highest priority, and the city's best resources were swiftly dispatched to aid the man who, though rarely seen in public, was infamous throughout Sweden. Emma Brooks was working in the emergency room when the call came in. She glanced at the screen patient coming in with symptoms of poisoning. "No time for details," the voice on the other end said urgently. "Prepare for the worst." Seconds felt like hours as she went into autopilot, her years of training kicking in. As she stood in the ER, mentally preparing for another long night of dealing with critical cases, she could feel the weight of her responsibilities pressing down on her shoulders. The doors to the ER suddenly swung open, and in rushed Ethan Gray, unconscious, his body limp, as two doctors and a security guard hurriedly wheeled him into the room. Emma Brooks's heart skipped a beat as she caught a glimpse of the man, Ethan Gray. She had heard his name more than once, usually in the context of business deals and tech innovations. He was everywhere, a name that dominated the headlines, and yet, until now, he had been nothing more than a distant figure in her world. But here he was, lying before her in a vulnerable state, dependent on her skill and expertise. She quickly moved into action, barking orders to the team around her, doing what she had been trained to do. The poison was spreading fast through his system, and time was of the essence. Her fingers moved with practiced precision as she administered antidotes and set up a drip to flush the toxins from his body. Her heart raced not out of fear, but from the responsibility that weighed on her to save his life. In the midst of it all, as the seconds dragged on, Emma Brooks felt something shift. There was no room for thinking about her circumstances, her world of modest means, or the struggles that she carried every day. There was only Ethan Gray, this powerful man, so often surrounded by wealth and power, now laying defenseless on her operating table. For the first time in a long while, Emma Brooks felt a strange pull, a reminder that behind the billion-dollar empire, Ethan Gray was human, just as fragile as anyone else. And as the antidote began to take effect, and his breathing steadied, Emma Brooks couldn't help but wonder how this unexpected, fateful encounter would alter the course of both of their lives. The gala was a spectacle of opulence, glimmering chandeliers bathed in golden light, guests in lavish attire, and the clinking of glasses creating a rhythmic melody in the background. It was a night designed for the elite, where business deals were made under the guise of social niceties, and everyone played their part. Among the sea of well-dressed men and women was Ethan Gray, the CEO of one of the most influential tech companies in the world. He stood at the center of the crowd, his commanding presence undeniable. Even surrounded by executives, dignitaries, and the country's wealthiest families, Ethan Gray's focus was always on the next deal, the next step in his rise. His world was one of strategy, ambition, and power, but that evening it was a world poised to come crashing down. He had no idea what was happening when the pain started. It began as a slight dizziness, a wave of nausea that he attributed to the wine he had been sipping. He tried to push it aside, but the sensation worsened. His heart began to race, and his chest tightened. A sharp, debilitating pain seared through his abdomen, and his vision blurred. Before he could call for help, the room seemed to spin out of control. His legs gave way beneath him, and he crumpled to the floor in front of the shocked onlookers. The guests screamed, some retreating in panic, while others fumbled with their phones to call for help. Ethan Gray's world, usually a picture of order and control, suddenly became a whirlwind of chaos. He struggled to breathe, his body betraying him in the most unexpected way. His mind raced, but the darkness was closing in quickly. Meanwhile, at the hospital, Emma Brooks had just clocked in for her evening shift. The night had been typical. Patients were steadily coming in with injuries, some serious, others minor. She had learned to navigate the frantic pace of the emergency room with precision, her calmness a necessary armor in a world where every decision could be life or death. As she readied herself for another long night of responding to the needs of patients, the hospital received a call from the nearby event. The message was brief. A high-profile patient was on the way, possibly poisoned. Emma Brooks wasn't unfamiliar with the occasional poisoning case, but this one felt different. The urgency in the nurse's voice on the phone gave her a sinking feeling. Moments later, an ambulance pulled up, and staff members rushed toward it. Ethan Gray was brought in on a gurney, his body limp and pale, a stark contrast to the strong, composed man who had just moments ago been the center of the gala. His breathing was shallow, and his skin was cold and clammy. Emma Brooks took immediate charge, assessing the situation. Her sharp eyes scanned his face, noting the clenched jaw and rapid pulse, the beads of sweat that dotted his forehead. He was still conscious, though barely, his eyes unfocused, flicking from side to side as though he was trying to make sense of what was happening to him. The symptoms were unmistakable. She had seen this before, a slow-acting poison designed to incapacitate, but one that could be countered with the right antidote. Without hesitation, Emma Brooks called for a blood sample and instructed the team to prepare the antidote. She was already working fast, coordinating with the other staff, but her mind was clear. She was focused solely on Ethan Gray's survival. As the antidote was administered, Emma Brooks continued to monitor his vitals, adjusting the IV drip and checking his heart rate. The minutes dragged on like hours, and she could see the battle within him, the quiet fight between life and death. She didn't flinch as she worked. This was her job, and she had done it countless times. But there was something about Ethan Gray's situation that stirred a deep, almost instinctive urgency within her. He wasn't just another patient. The antidote took effect slowly. Ethan Gray's breathing steadied, and his pulse began to regulate. Emma Brooks remained by his side, watching carefully as the tension in his body started to ease. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, his eyelids fluttered, and he let out a soft groan. Slowly, his eyes opened. The dim light of the hospital room was harsh against his senses. His mind was foggy, still disoriented from the effects of the poison. He blinked, trying to focus, his vision sharpening just enough to make out the figure standing beside him. It was a woman. No, a nurse. She was young, but her presence was calm, steady. Her face was gentle but focused, her eyes reflecting a quiet confidence that soothed him even in his fragile state. What happened? Ethan Gray's voice was raspy, but it carried the familiar authority that marked him as a man used to command. "You were poisoned," Emma Brooks replied, her tone steady, devoid of any unnecessary emotion. "We've administered the antidote. You should be feeling better now." Ethan Gray blinked again, as though trying to process what she had said. His body still felt weak, but the pain had subsided. He turned his head, catching her gaze. Something about her demeanor intrigued him, how she was completely unruffled by the situation. Her attention solely on him, yet devoid of any desire for recognition. She wasn't fawning over him, as most people would, and it unsettled him in a way he couldn't quite understand. "Thank you," he managed, his voice still shaky but sincere. "You saved my life." Emma Brooks gave a small nod, her expression neutral. "It's my job," she said simply, stepping back slightly to give him space to adjust. "I'm just glad we were able to help." Ethan Gray studied her for a moment longer, noticing how different she was from the polished, performative personalities he was used to encountering. There was no flattery, no ulterior motive, just professionalism and quiet competence. In a world where everyone seemed to have a hidden agenda, Emma Brooks's sincerity stood out like a beacon in the dark. She was different, and somehow that made her all the more intriguing. As Emma Brooks prepared to leave him to rest, Ethan Gray called out softly, "What's your name?" "Emma Brooks," she replied, pausing in the doorway. His gaze lingered on her for a moment longer before he nodded, as if committing her to memory. He didn't know why, but he felt the need to know more about this woman. The poison had been a threat to his life, but it was this unexpected encounter with Emma Brooks that would prove to be the true turning point in his world. Ethan Gray's return to the hospital was deliberate, though to the casual observer it appeared as nothing more than a routine follow-up. His body had recovered from the effects of the poison, the antidote working wonders, but there was something far more pressing on his mind than just his physical health. He had come back with one goal: to see Emma Brooks again. At first, it was just a passing thought, a fleeting curiosity about the woman who had saved his life. But as the days passed, his mind lingered on her, replaying the moment he had first seen her, her focused demeanor as she calmly administered the antidote. There was something in her that he couldn't quite explain, something that made her stand out in a world of superficiality and shallow gestures. The hospital was busy, as always, and when Ethan Gray walked in, it was clear he wasn't just another patient here to check in. The nurses and staff immediately recognized him, but Ethan Gray was not interested in the attention. His eyes scanned the room until he spotted her Emma Brooks moving among the patients with grace and purpose, her focus entirely on her work. He asked around, carefully and subtly, under the pretense of inquiring about his follow-up care. No one seemed to mind, and soon he learned more about her. Emma Brooks was in her late 20s, a nurse with a reputation for being reliable and deeply compassionate. She had come from a modest background, working hard to support herself and her sick mother. Her life was one of duty and sacrifice, nothing like the glamorous, polished lives of the women in Ethan Gray's world. Yet, despite the difference in their stations, there was a pull, a magnetic force that he couldn't ignore. For Emma Brooks, Ethan Gray's return was the last thing she expected. She had thought he would disappear from her life as quickly as he had appeared. He was a CEO, a man of immense wealth and power, worlds apart from her own humble life. She had seen enough of men like him to know their world was not one where someone like her could belong. It was a world of expectations, of false smiles, of relationships based on status rather than true connection. But as Ethan Gray entered the hospital room, his presence was undeniable. He looked different from the arrogant, self-assured man she had first encountered at the gala. There was a quiet vulnerability in his eyes, something that made her pause. He wasn't as imposing in person, not when he wasn't surrounded by his entourage or seated at the head of a table full of power players. Here, in the sterile, bustling environment of the hospital, he was just another man trying to piece together the fragments of his life. "Emma Brooks," Ethan Gray said as he approached her, his voice softer than it had been before. "I'm glad to see you again." Emma Brooks hesitated, her heart racing for reasons she couldn't quite understand. She kept her expression neutral, careful not to let the flutter of her pulse betray her. "I'm glad you're feeling better, Mr. Ginny. How can I assist you today?" He was being polite, but his gaze lingered on her, a soft intensity that made Emma Brooks feel both uncomfortable and strangely seen. She quickly turned away, focusing on his medical charts to avoid meeting his eyes. Despite herself, she couldn't deny that his presence stirred something in her, something she didn't want to feel. "Please call me Ethan Gray," he said, his voice carrying a hint of earnestness. "I've been meaning to thank you properly for saving my life." Emma Brooks merely nodded, her usual professional distance holding steady. She had learned to separate herself from the emotions of her job. But even as she spoke, she found herself studying him more carefully. He was so unlike the polished businessmen she had seen at events, with their rehearsed smiles and guarded emotions. Ethan Gray seemed different. There was a rawness about him, an openness in his vulnerability that made him strangely disarming. As Ethan Gray continued to visit the hospital, he found his interactions with Emma Brooks becoming less about his recovery and more about their conversations. There were no superficial topics, no polite small talk. Instead, they talked about their lives, their struggles, and the complexities of the world they inhabited. Ethan Gray learned more about Emma Brooks's background, the financial burden of her mother's illness, the sacrifices she had made to keep their family afloat, the quiet strength she carried despite everything life had thrown her way. He admired her resilience, but it was her kindness that captivated him most. She, on the other hand, couldn't quite reconcile her growing interest in him. She had no illusions about his world. She had seen the way he carried himself, his power, his wealth, and the cold distance he maintained from the rest of the world. It was a world she couldn't fathom, a world where people were measured by their influence and their bank accounts. She couldn't imagine being part of it, and she certainly couldn't allow herself to fall for someone like him. Her heart, however, had other ideas. The more time they spent together, the more she began to notice the subtle shifts in him, the way he softened when he spoke to her, the way his demeanor changed when they were alone. It was as if, for the first time, he wasn't playing a role, and that scared her. Could she afford to get too close? What would happen if she did? Was she just a fleeting distraction for him, another story to tell in his endless parade of encounters? The tension between them was palpable. Both Emma Brooks and Ethan Gray felt the pull of something deeper, something neither had expected. Ethan Gray, for all his power and confidence, had begun to see the world differently. Emma Brooks wasn't just a nurse or a symbol of his recovery. She was someone who had challenged him, who had made him question the life he had built. And he wasn't sure if he was ready to confront that yet. Emma Brooks, on the other hand, struggled with her growing feelings. She couldn't deny the attraction she felt, but she refused to let herself get swept away by it. She knew better than to mix her modest life with his world. It was a dangerous game to play, and she was too practical to take that risk. Yet in the quiet moments when their eyes met and the silence stretched between them, both of them knew this was no ordinary connection. It was something far more complicated and perhaps more real than either of them could have imagined. The quiet hum of the hospital during late night shifts was one of Emma Brooks's few moments of peace, and yet it often served as the backdrop to her mind's racing thoughts. The past few weeks had been tumultuous, her growing connection with Ethan Gray, his insistence on knowing more about her, and the silent pull she felt toward him. But there were truths about herself that Emma Brooks had kept hidden, even from those closest to her. To her, her life was a balancing act, always about others and never about herself. She was at the nurse's station, checking her patients' charts, when her thoughts wandered back to her mother, who had been suffering from a degenerative disease for years. Emma Brooks had always taken on the role of caregiver, putting her own dreams on hold to ensure her mother's health and well-being. She had studied nursing not out of passion, but out of necessity. Her mother's condition had forced her hand, and the steady paycheck from nursing provided the security they both desperately needed. There was no time for anything else, no time for her aspirations or the fleeting fantasies she had once held about a life outside the sterile hospital halls. Her mother's illness wasn't just physical, it had changed Emma Brooks too. She had become a caretaker, a provider, and yet, somewhere along the way, she had lost sight of who she was beyond these roles. She had grown used to the feeling of being invisible, except for the times when she was needed. Her heart longed for something more, but the weight of responsibility kept her grounded, suffocating her hopes. She didn't know how to explain this to Ethan Gray, the man who had seemingly entered her life like a storm, throwing everything she thought she knew into disarray. Every time he looked at her, she saw something that confused her, a depth, an understanding, a kindness that no one had shown her before. But she couldn't allow herself to get swept away by his attention. She knew better than to think someone like him would ever truly care for someone like her. Ethan Gray's investigation into Emma Brooks's life was more than just idle curiosity. He had spent days asking around about her, trying to piece together the fragments of her life that she kept hidden behind her reserved demeanor. It didn't take long for him to learn about her mother's illness. There was no information in the public sphere about her. Emma Brooks had kept it all tightly wrapped around herself, unwilling to let anyone in on her burdens. When Ethan Gray visited her mother's hospital room, he found Emma Brooks's world in sharp contrast to his own. His life, filled with wealth and power, now seemed distant, shallow even, in comparison to the humble reality of Emma Brooks's life. Her mother's frailty, the quiet determination in Emma Brooks's eyes as she cared for her, it was all so foreign to him, and yet it moved him in a way he couldn't explain. "I've heard a lot about you," Ethan Gray said as he sat beside Emma Brooks's mother, who was too weak to acknowledge his presence. "You've sacrificed a lot to take care of your mother." Emma Brooks, standing at the foot of the bed, stiffened. "It's just what I do." He wasn't prepared for the sharpness in her voice, the defensive edge that she always seemed to carry. He had assumed, naively, that offering his financial support, offering her a way out of the struggles she had to endure, would be a gesture of goodwill. But the look on her face told him otherwise. "I don't need your charity, Ethan Gray," Emma Brooks snapped, her gaze hardening. "I didn't ask for your help." He felt the sting of her words, but he couldn't back down. He had seen how tirelessly she worked, how she gave everything to her mother. He couldn't stand by and do nothing when she was drowning in a sea of responsibility. "I'm not offering charity," he said, his voice steady but firm. "I want to help. I don't expect anything in return. You're too proud to ask for help, but that doesn't mean it's not there for you." Her eyes softened slightly, but the walls she had built around herself remained impenetrable. "I don't need your pity," she muttered, turning away to adjust her mother's blanket. Ethan Gray didn't press her further, but the discomfort in the room lingered, a silent reminder that his presence had disrupted something she wasn't ready to face. While Ethan Gray grappled with Emma Brooks's rejection of his offer, another problem was brewing, one far more dangerous than his growing feelings for her. He had started digging into the poisoning incident, and what he uncovered shocked him. It wasn't an accident. It was deliberate. Ethan Gray's own instincts, his experience with power and control, told him the poison wasn't the work of an outsider. Someone in his inner circle had orchestrated it, someone with a vested interest in seeing him fall. As he pieced together the evidence, he discovered that a rival company was behind the poisoning, aiming to weaken his position in the business world. Their plan had been simple: remove Ethan Gray, discredit him, and take over his empire. It was a game of power, and he was the pawn. But the more he uncovered, the more unsettling the situation became. He realized that Emma Brooks might be more entangled in this mess than he had first thought. One night, as he was poring over the details of the poisoning, a call came through that made his blood run cold. A mysterious figure, someone he didn't recognize, had been asking around about Emma Brooks. It seemed like his enemies weren't content with just targeting him. They were now trying to find leverage by threatening the woman who had saved his life. They had approached Emma Brooks, trying to blackmail her into giving them information about him. The walls around Ethan Gray's carefully constructed world were crumbling, and now the woman he had begun to care for was caught in the crossfire. He wasn't sure how much longer he could protect her without exposing himself, and yet he knew one thing for certain: he would do whatever it took to keep her safe. Emma Brooks had no idea what she was about to face. But Ethan Gray, for the first time in years, was ready to fight not for his company, but for the woman he had come to care for deeply. The days following Ethan Gray's discovery of the threat against Emma Brooks had been filled with a heavy silence. He knew the truth now, that the poison had been part of a far larger conspiracy, a corporate war fought in the shadows of boardrooms and behind closed doors. Yet, the deeper he delved into this darkness, the more pressing a truth became. His heart, something he had long shut off, was now inexplicably attached to Emma Brooks. Every moment he spent with her made him realize how different she was from anyone else in his life. Emma Brooks was not impressed by his wealth, his power, or his position in the world. She wasn't drawn to him because of his status or the way people revered him. She saw him for who he truly was, a man burdened by the expectations placed upon him. And that raw authenticity, that honesty, was what Ethan Gray found himself craving. But for Emma Brooks, love was not something she could afford to entertain. The disparity between their worlds was too vast for her to ignore. Ethan Gray's life was a world of luxury and ambition, while hers was a life filled with simple, humble moments, late shifts at the hospital, caring for her ailing mother, and the constant struggle to make ends meet. The idea of fitting into his world, of becoming a part of it, felt impossible to her. She was not naive enough to believe their worlds could ever merge without one of them breaking. Every time Ethan Gray reached out, every time he spoke to her with that soft, earnest tone, Emma Brooks felt a knot tighten in her chest. She longed for the warmth of his affection, but recoiled from the pain she imagined would come if she allowed herself to fully give in to him. "What do I have to offer him?" she asked herself often. Her insecurities ate at her. She wasn't good enough. Her love, as kind and selfless as it was, couldn't possibly hold the same weight as his world. Meanwhile, Ethan Gray could sense her reluctance. He could see the hesitancy in her eyes, feel the walls she had built around her heart. Despite his best efforts to reassure her, he knew she was still wary of him. The thought that someone like him, so accustomed to control, to power, could ever truly understand her struggles, let alone love her in the way she needed, seemed far-fetched. Her modesty, her integrity, and her fierce independence created a stark contrast to the way he was used to interacting with women, shallow, transactional, and often driven by their own ambitions. It wasn't just Emma Brooks's reluctance that weighed on him. It was his mother's disapproval, which loomed over him like a dark cloud. The matriarch of the family, strong and unwavering, had always had clear expectations for him. She had carefully chosen the woman she believed was worthy of her son's position, someone from the right background, someone who could strengthen the family's empire, someone who could ensure their place in the world. From the moment his mother had heard about Emma Brooks, she had been vehement in her objections. "She's nothing but a nurse, Ethan Gray," his mother had said coldly. "A woman from a background like hers can never be the wife of a man of your stature. She'll drag you down." Ethan Gray knew this wasn't just about Emma Brooks. It was about the way his mother had shaped his life carefully and with a singular focus on power and legacy. The woman his mother had chosen for him was the perfect match in terms of family ties, wealth, and status. But none of that meant anything to Ethan Gray. He had seen that kind of life for what it was, shallow, suffocating, and devoid of real meaning. It was not a life he wanted for himself, nor could he allow it to dictate who he loved. But the pressure from his mother was immense. "You cannot throw everything away for a woman like her," she had insisted one night, her voice sharp. "You're making a mistake, Ethan Gray. I won't let you ruin everything we've worked for." He felt trapped, torn between his love for Emma Brooks and his duty to his family. His mother had made it clear that if he chose Emma Brooks, he would be cutting ties with the only life he had ever known. The family's legacy, the business empire he had inherited, would be at risk. And yet, when he looked at Emma Brooks, when he saw the way she cared for others without hesitation, when he saw the quiet strength in her eyes, he knew that she was everything he had been searching for in a world full of empty promises. As if the emotional turmoil wasn't enough, the external pressure continued to escalate. The rival company, the one that had orchestrated the poisoning, had now begun targeting Emma Brooks directly. Ethan Gray's enemies were no longer content with simply attacking him. They were going after anyone close to him, anyone who could be used as leverage. One evening, after a particularly grueling day at the hospital, Emma Brooks received a call from an unfamiliar number. She answered, her voice weary from exhaustion. "Hello." The voice on the other end was low, unsettling. "We know who you are, Emma Brooks. We know about your mother's condition and your connection to Ethan Gray." Emma Brooks's stomach tightened. "What do you want?" The man's voice was cold, calculating. "We need you to deliver a message to him. If you don't, we'll make sure your mother's treatment stops." A chill ran down Emma Brooks's spine. She had heard of corporate threats like these faceless enemies trying to manipulate and control, but she never imagined she would be caught in their crossfire. The call ended abruptly, leaving her in stunned silence. Ethan Gray was the first person she went to when she heard of the threat. She didn't want to pull him into her mess, but she didn't know where else to turn. His presence had always made her feel safe, but now it was different. His safety was at risk because of her. When she told him what had happened, he didn't flinch. His jaw tightened, his hands clenched at his sides, but his gaze was unwavering. "I'll make sure they never threaten you again," he said, his voice steady. "You're not alone in this." For the first time, Emma Brooks allowed herself to believe him. But deep down, she knew this wasn't just a battle against a rival company anymore. It was a battle for both their lives. She was no longer just a nurse in his world. She had become an integral part of the storm that surrounded them both. And Ethan Gray knew this battle wouldn't end with just corporate threats. It would force him to choose once and for all between his duty to his family, the life he had been groomed for, and the woman he was slowly learning to love with everything he had. Emma Brooks's life seemed to have no room for peace anymore. With each passing day, the threats from Ethan Gray's world suffocated her, and she felt like she was being pulled under. Her mother, the woman who had given everything to raise her, was getting worse, and the threats from Ethan Gray's enemies were like dark shadows hanging over them both. Emma Brooks couldn't imagine a future in this world, a world that wasn't hers, where all the values she had built, compassion, humility and peace, seemed swallowed by the greed and power of Ethan Gray's world. Every time she saw her mother getting weaker, Emma Brooks's heart felt heavier. She told herself that no matter how much she loved Ethan Gray, he would never be able to protect her from the dangers around him. She couldn't risk it anymore. She couldn't let her love become a burden to him or her mother. Emma Brooks felt like she was trapped in a shell, unable to break free, unable to be her true self. One late evening, as Ethan Gray stood outside her room, his gaze serious and worried, Emma Brooks couldn't take it anymore. She couldn't be part of his world. She had to make a decision. "I can't do this, Ethan Gray." Emma Brooks's voice cracked, tears threatening to spill. "I love you, but I can't live like this. You can't protect me, and I can't protect you. Your world is so different from mine. You can't have both me and that world." Ethan Gray stood frozen, his expression full of confusion and pain. He had thought he could protect her, that he could keep her safe within the life he built. But now he understood that there was no way to shield her from the very people he called his family, or the shadow of power he carried on his shoulders. "Emma Brooks, please don't go," Ethan Gray begged, his voice thick with emotion. "You are everything to me. I can't live without you." But Emma Brooks remained firm. She wiped away her tears, shaking her head in anguish. "I can't live in your world, Ethan Gray. I can't just love you and give up everything I've built. I love you, but I can't risk living like this." And so, with a broken heart, she turned away, leaving the room, leaving the man she loved, in the most painful decision she knew would cost them both. But she also knew it was the best thing for both herself and for him. Ethan Gray realizes he can't live without her. After Emma Brooks left, Ethan Gray stood there, his eyes hollow, as though everything around him had collapsed. He tried to push the emptiness away, to convince himself that it was the right decision, but his heart couldn't follow his mind. He had faced many challenges in his life, but none compared to the pain he felt now. Day by day, he came to realize that he couldn't continue in this world. Everything he had built, from the company to the relationships to the fame, seemed meaningless without her. She was the only person who made his world worth living in. Emma Brooks was the only one who made him feel like himself. She had changed everything in him, made him reevaluate the true values of life, love, and what it means to be free. He couldn't just live for his family anymore, for the business empire he inherited. He couldn't keep standing still while others decided his future. And in that moment, Ethan Gray decided he would not let Emma Brooks go. He would not live a life without her. A few days later, Ethan Gray stood in the middle of a family meeting, where everyone from the senior members of his company to major stakeholders was present. They were discussing plans for future expansion, but Ethan Gray wasn't focused on the business anymore. He had made up his mind. "Mother, father," Ethan Gray said, his voice cold and resolute, "I can't continue with this life. I can't live up to the expectations of the family. I won't take over the company, and I don't care about what you all think of me." His mother, always the one to place the family and power above all, was shocked. "Ethan Gray, what are you saying? This company is your future, the future of this family. If you leave, you'll destroy everything we've built." "I don't care about any of that," Ethan Gray interrupted, his voice firm. "I don't want this world anymore. I want to live with Emma Brooks, a life without power, without pretense. I love her, and I will not let anyone stop us." His words rang out like a declaration of war. He wasn't afraid anymore. He wasn't worried about losing his family or his career. All he cared about was being with Emma Brooks, living a life that was true to who he really was. Ethan Gray went to find Emma Brooks one late afternoon when she was standing outside her small house, gazing out at the busy streets. When she saw him, her heart skipped a beat, but this time she didn't turn away. He walked toward her, his eyes full of determination, something she had never seen in him before. "Emma Brooks," Ethan Gray said softly, his voice full of sincerity. "I've chosen you. I've given up everything to be with you. I love you, and I want to build a life with you, not a life built on power or appearances. Just us." Tears welled up in Emma Brooks' eyes as she looked into his gaze, no longer seeing the world of wealth, power, or manipulation. All she saw was sincerity, love, and a determination that spoke louder than words. She could feel her heart racing, emotions flooding her. She finally spoke, her voice trembling but full of emotion. "I love you, Ethan Gray. I love you so much. I've always feared that our love couldn't last, but now I understand that only true love matters. You've shown me that." Ethan Gray smiled, taking her hand in his, and for the first time in his life, he felt truly free. Nothing else mattered anymore. They were going to live their lives together, free from the expectations of the world around them, free to build their own dreams, side by side. Their love had overcome the barriers of wealth, status, and family. It was a love that was pure and unwavering, a love that would last a lifetime. And together they would create a future that was built on authenticity, trust, and the power of their shared connection. As the seasons changed and the months passed, life began to fall into a new rhythm for Ethan Gray and Emma Brooks. The whirlwind of their past, filled with uncertainty, danger, and power struggles, had finally calmed. But even in the quiet moments, they knew their journey together was far from over. Ethan Gray, now far removed from the world of corporate boardrooms and cutthroat negotiations, discovered a sense of purpose he had never thought possible. He still grappled with moments of doubt when the old pressures crept into his mind or when memories of his family's disapproval lingered. Yet in those moments, Emma Brooks was there, offering a gentle reminder that he was on the right path. Emma Brooks, too, had experienced a profound transformation. Her work as a nurse, while fulfilling, no longer defined her existence. It was just one aspect of her life, one that she was incredibly proud of, but not the sole measure of her worth. Her pursuit of further education, her work in public health, and the growing support of the charity were all affirmations that she had the power to build the life she wanted. And yet, despite her success, there were moments of self-doubt when she wondered if she was truly worthy of the life she now shared with Ethan Gray. The selfless, humble woman who had once quietly cared for others in the background now found herself in the spotlight, a position she had never sought but was learning to embrace. As the charity grew, Ethan Gray and Emma Brooks began to see the tangible impact of their work. The healthcare program that had started as a small initiative blossomed into a nationwide network, providing free medical services to thousands of people. Ethan Gray took a step back from managing the day-to-day operations, allowing a team of experts to lead the way, while he focused on larger partnerships and advocacy. Emma Brooks worked closely with the medical staff, ensuring the program's success and efficiency. Together, they made a formidable team. But as their influence grew, so did the challenges. One evening, while Ethan Gray was reviewing reports at their apartment, he received a call from one of his former business associates. The man, once a colleague in the high-stakes corporate world, had called to congratulate him on his charity's success. But beneath the pleasantries, Ethan Gray could hear a familiar tone, a mix of skepticism and doubt. "Ethan Gray, I'll be blunt," the man said, his voice tinged with a hint of amusement. "You were always the one destined to lead the biggest tech conglomerate in the world, and now you're playing the part of the philanthropist. Is this really what you want?" Ethan Gray sighed, leaning back in his chair. He could feel the weight of the old world pulling at him. His former associate had always believed in power, influence, and control. The idea of Ethan Gray choosing a life of compassion over conquest was baffling to him. "I've found my calling," Ethan Gray replied, his voice steady but firm. "It's not about dominating industries or accumulating wealth anymore. It's about making a difference in people's lives." The line was silent for a long moment before the man spoke again. "Well, I suppose if it makes you happy, but don't say I didn't warn you. The world won't care about your charity when the stakes are this high." Ethan Gray's eyes flicked to Emma Brooks, who had just entered the room. He smiled at her, feeling a sense of calm wash over him. "The world may not care, but I do," he said, his words now more for himself than for the man on the other end of the line. Later that evening, Ethan Gray shared the conversation with Emma Brooks. He could sense her concern as she listened, but there was also something in her eyes, something stronger, more resolute than before. "Are you second-guessing yourself?" Emma Brooks asked softly, her voice filled with understanding. Ethan Gray shook his head. "No, it's just the pressure is always there, the expectations. Sometimes I wonder if I made the right choice, leaving everything behind." Emma Brooks took a step closer, placing her hand gently on his. "You didn't just leave everything behind. You built something better, and you're not alone in this. We're in this together." Her words were a reminder of how far they had come, not just in their careers, but in their personal growth too. The path ahead was no longer clouded with uncertainty. They had built a life based on mutual respect, love, and shared purpose. As the months rolled on, Ethan Gray found that he was no longer burdened by the weight of expectations. The world around him may have been skeptical, but the fulfillment he found in his work, the joy he shared with Emma Brooks, and the lives they touched were all the validation he needed. With Emma Brooks by his side, he found that he could weather any storm. One particular day, Emma Brooks came home from the hospital with a sense of excitement in her eyes. She had just been offered a position at a prestigious medical institution, a job that would take her public health work to new heights. It was an incredible opportunity, one that she had worked tirelessly for, and Ethan Gray could see the pride in her face as she told him the news. "Emma Brooks, this is amazing. You've worked so hard for this," Ethan Gray said, his voice full of admiration. She smiled, but there was a hint of hesitation in her gaze. "It's just, I don't want to leave everything behind. I love the work we're doing with the charity, and I'm not sure if I can balance it all." Ethan Gray squeezed her hand, his own heart swelling with pride. "You don't have to choose between the two. This is your time, Emma Brooks. You've earned it. And I'll be here to support you every step of the way, no matter where that path leads." The reassurance in his voice lifted the weight from her shoulders. Emma Brooks had always placed others first, always put herself second. But with Ethan Gray's unwavering support, she realized that it was time to put herself first for once. She had the opportunity to make a real difference, and she was ready to take it. And so, with Ethan Gray's encouragement, Emma Brooks accepted the offer. But she also made sure that her work with the charity would continue. She would split her time between her new role and her commitment to helping others. It wasn't easy, but it was the life she wanted, one where she could continue making an impact on a larger scale, but still stay grounded in the mission they had created together. As they both found their footing in their new roles, Ethan Gray and Emma Brooks took on the challenges of their respective careers, but they did so with the knowledge that their foundation was stronger than ever. No longer tethered to the expectations of the past, they embraced the present, living a life of purpose, passion, and mutual support. The future was no longer defined by what they had left behind. It was defined by what they had built together, an unshakable bond, grounded in love and authenticity. And as they looked ahead, hand in hand, they knew that no challenge would ever be too great as long as they faced it together. Their new beginning had only just begun, but it was a beginning they had both earned. A beginning that would be filled with hope, growth, and, most importantly, love. After everything they've faced, the danger, the secrets, the betrayals, Emma Brooks and Ethan Gray finally find a way to be together. Ethan Gray, once trapped by his family's expectations and his corporate empire, has stepped away from it all to follow his heart. Emma Brooks, a woman who once believed her humble beginnings would hold her back, has realized that her worth comes from within, and love, true love, doesn't care about status or money. Together, they've shown that even in a world of power and wealth, the most important thing is authenticity and connection. Despite the odds, they've built a life that's theirs, free from the shadows of their pasts. Their journey is just beginning, but one thing is clear: they're ready to face whatever comes next, as long as they're together. If you've enjoyed this roller coaster of emotions, love and suspense, make sure to subscribe and stay tuned for more captivating stories. You won't want to miss the next chapter of heart-stopping romance and unforgettable twists.